Hello, everybody, and welcome to this seventh seminar of the Educational Work Group of the Italian Reproducibility Network. Thank you, all of you, for attending this seminar today with Jonny Coates, who I'm introducing him in a brief. But first, let me thank you, the Italian Association of Psychology, for supporting our seminar and our endeavors here at ITRN. Let me introduce you now our today's speakers, Jonny Coates, who is going to talk of a presentation titled Preprints Putting the P in PRC. Jonny Coates is a leading advocate for academic reform and open science with a particular focus on promoting the adoption of preprints in the biosciences. He works to advance the use of preprints and foster open scientific practices. With over 10 years of experience in immunology and metascience, Dr. Coates has been actively involved in the preprint movement since 2017. He hosts the Preprints in Motion podcast, which highlights the benefits of preprints for early career researchers. His advocacy extends beyond podcasting. He has written for various scientific outlets and contributed to journalistic pieces in publications like The Economist, The Scientist, and Nature on topics related to open science and academic culture. So, Jonny, you're very welcome, and the stage is yours.
Thank you. I will share my screen.
Mm-hmm.
And that should be full screen. So I do have the chat open on another monitor. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in. If it's relevant, I will stop as I go. Otherwise, I will get to them at the end. So this is about the PRC model. But what I'm going to do is very much focus on the preprint part of that model. And towards the end of this, I'm also going to sort of step back a little bit and ask some questions that I think we should always ask when we're advocating for change, which hopefully won't be too controversial. If you do have any questions afterwards, or you just want to talk about preprints, academic culture, whatever you want, you can find me on Blue Sky. I am still on Mastodon as well. Don't use very much. Or you can email me, and I will drop my email in the chat towards the end as well. Before we get properly started, I just want to set the scene a little bit and talk about why we need to change scientific publishing. We've had a huge technological advance, sort of in the past 30 plus years. And yet academia really lags behind all of this. Scientific publishing in particular feels like it's still stuck in the print era. It hasn't quite caught up to everything being online and digital. And these are just two really interesting bits of data that show journal publications taking a long time, and that's a bad thing. So this first one here on the left is the time it takes to get your first author paper, which in the biological sciences, which is my background, that's like the key author position. So 70s to 80s, this was taking just under 5 years on average, and 10 years ago now, this had risen to about 6 years on average. It's higher now again, although there's not really much data yet to show that. And then this is a really interesting graph I always find. So on the right here, what you're seeing is just a count of the number of panels that make up figures in journal articles for Cell, Nature, and the Journal of Cell Biology. Again, it's comparing a similar time period, so the 1984 to 2014. What's really interesting here is that during the 80s, we didn't have supplemental information. So we didn't have all these long supplemental files of data and extra bits. And actually, the total number of panels in the main papers were relatively low, especially if you compare it to 2014. So what we can see in 2014, we now not only have these supplemental files, but they are at least as big as an entire paper from the 1980s, if not multitudes bigger. And that's just the supplemental files. In all cases here, the actual content within the paper itself is fairly significantly increased. Not a big surprise. We've had all these advances in techniques and things we can do, so we can ask more difficult questions. We can ask bigger questions. Obviously, big data sets have lots of panels and things like that. So this isn't a big surprise, but this does add to the difficulty in navigating the literature. Another related issue is that publication is now costing just an obscene amount of money. It's estimated, and these estimates are really hard to do, so the range is between $4 and $6 billion a year is spent just on peer review activities. That's a huge amount of money that we could do way better things with if that went to research instead. It also really draws an important question to ask about what peer review is achieving and what it's not achieving, which I might talk about a little bit. And one of the things we've seen to combat this is the open access movement. Started sort of around the 1990s, it's been going for quite a while, and I would argue it has not been very successful, although it has laid the groundwork for a lot of other things. But what you're seeing here is data from 2023. Again, this is an estimate. Estimates are hard to do, but this is estimating the revenue just from article processing charges across the big 5 publishers. Basically, what you're seeing is they've made around $1 billion between 2015 and 2018 in just article processing charges. Now, since 2018, gold open access has exploded even more, so this number is going to be considerably higher if you were to look at more recent data. There are 2 papers I've seen estimating this, and they both come out around that number, so it's probably fairly reliable. And underneath here, this is a breakdown, again, same number essentially, but broken down by discipline and field. And I like this graph because this shows why I think it's so important that any change to science communication must happen within the life sciences first. Because if you look here, the life sciences, which are these top 2 bars here, together, or even just alone, they constitute more in revenue to publishers than all the other fields combined. If we don't change those fields, it doesn't matter what else you do elsewhere. The publishers will still dominate and academia will still be a pretty miserable experience because of that. The reason this is all happening is that publishing, as we currently define it, is tangled up into a bunch of different things. And what we need to do is untangle that. So to untangle publishing, what we need to do is pull out these 3 or 4 main components. So we need to separate dissemination from peer review and from curation and prestige. At the moment, this is all done by journals. They disseminate our work, they do the peer review, they do the curation and all the prestige signals. That's not good for science. It creates a lot of wrong incentives for scientists and researchers. And it needs to change. And so this is what the publish, review, curate model kind of does. So what publish, review, curate is, and this nice little handy graphic here, is it separates out these steps into a publishing step that should be independent of the review step, which should also be independent of the curation step. So dissemination could be preprints, which is what I'm going to talk about, but it could also be data, code, open notebooks. Peer review should therefore become more of a service, potentially, rather than it being tied up with the publishing process. We're seeing this with things like Review Commons or the PCI initiatives. And then curation currently is not a separate step, although it should be. And curation could be where journals come into play. It could be specific curation projects, could be individuals making a list of things they like. That is curation. And I also argue that prestige should then be an entirely separate thing on its own as well. At the moment, this is not being achieved. Review and curation are one thing at the moment in all of the PRC models that exist. I think that's a big downside, but it's also part of the journey towards getting a more decentralized system, I guess. Ultimately, what this system does is it creates a much greater recognition for the individual components and for individual efforts. So you can imagine a situation in this model where peer review actually counts towards hiring and promotion. And it's a recognized service activity. Whereas at the moment, for most places in the world, it's not given the recognition it deserves. Now, preprints, if you're not familiar with them, are the bedrock of this PRC model, really. So the normal process of submitting, as we all are probably well aware of, is you submit your manuscript to a journal. The editor may reject it. They may send it out for peer review. You keep doing this until your manuscript goes for peer review and you satisfy enough peer reviewers that they say, yes, we will accept your paper. Once that happens, it can then take another 3+ months before your paper actually gets published online and is available for people to read. This whole process, on average, takes between 6 and 12 months for biological sciences, even longer in other fields. Preprints, on the other hand, are same manuscript, but you submit that to a preprint server. It undergoes some basic screening processes, so not anything by anyone can be posted on a preprint server. And even at the height of the COVID pandemic, preprint servers were getting the work online, available for everyone to use and read within 48 hours. And they were seeing huge increases in the amount of submissions they were getting during that period as well. So you can see 48 hours to public work compared to a year, potentially more. The longest I've ever seen from submitting a manuscript to it appearing online was 22 years. So you're gonna, it's a big saving there. And just to define preprint, because this is something a lot of people are a little bit unsure about, preprints are generally complete manuscripts. They're openly shared online prior to journal organized peer review. They are citable, they've got DOI, they're permanent, they can be peer reviewed, and they are shared when the authors believe that their work is ready for sharing. They are not necessarily preliminary or early work. They can be, but I've looked into this and I would say 99.5% maybe of all preprints are actual solid manuscripts. They're not early work. They're not necessarily low quality or incomplete. Again, I've also looked at this, and if you compare preprints to their published version, very little changes for the most part. And they're also not rushed work. The problems you see with preprints are also the same problems you'll see with the peer-reviewed literature. So it's important to also bear that in mind. They are formal scientific outputs, and there's a lot of things here going on. So they are linked to the final paper and any commentary that is associated with that. I should have made these come up one by one. They are permanent, as I've said. You can version a preprint. So you're seeing a preprint here that has 3 different versions. This is really great if you do want to update your work as you go, or if you've got reviewer comments and you want to update it. You choose your license. Various preprint servers might require you to have a certain license. The license choice is really important because that's the difference between open work and not open work in terms of reusability. You can get feedback through a variety of sources. If you go on bioRxiv now, this actually looks different. This toolbar appears here instead now. They are citable, as I've said, and they are generally complete work. One thing you will find with preprints is quite often people will leave out data sets and things until it's been published, which annoys me, and I'm hoping to change that. But that's the only real big difference you will find between a preprint and its published version. I said that before peer review, they can be peer reviewed by a whole range of different services now. And if we just look at the life sciences, we have over 700,000 life science preprints. That was up to the beginning of 2024. There's more now. I just haven't updated this graph because it's got some nice key milestones on it. Preprinting started actually in the 1960s in the life sciences, but it was quickly shut down by the publishers. And so it wasn't really until about 2013 when it started to take off. And that's when bioRxiv was founded, which is why this graph is kind of a bit of a lag. The pandemic had a huge boost to that, which is the sort of period you're seeing here. But you can see since the pandemic, that's maintained. So the boost is still there, which is quite nice. A lot of organizations have preprint policies. Some of these were quite early on. Some of them are still coming through now. And the biggest, I guess, new bit of news would be eLife's model when they switched in 2023. As a percentage of the published literature, although preprints are growing, it is still a very small number. So in 2019, preprints represented about 5% of all published articles for biomedicine. And in 2024, at the end of 2024, it was about 13%. So although some fields this is growing really great and it's really is expanding, this is still a very small percentage. So there's still a huge amount of work to do around getting this adopted more widely. But one of the big barriers, one of the big benefits of preprints is that they reduce barriers to sharing. So they're a lot more accessible than journal publications. This is some, I don't want to call it old, but this kind of old data. Basically showing that the percentage of preprints that are eventually published really, really do congregate to high income countries, the global north, which is what you're seeing here in all the light colored, orangey yellow colors here. So about 65% of preprints that are published come from these high income countries compared to the low income countries. And this is really a commentary on the cost of publishing more than anything. Preprints also account for about 40% of early responses to public health emergencies. This is a chart showing you the first 10 months of the COVID pandemic. You've got the preprints on the bottom, journal articles on top here. This is cumulative. And around this point in June, there was still about 60% of the literature. But across the first 10 months, it ended up being 40%. This is 40% of research we probably wouldn't have otherwise seen, at least this quickly. Probably don't have to rehash why that was important in COVID. This is also held true with an Mpox outbreak more recently. So it looks like they are having quite significant impacts. There were some comments made during the pandemic that preprints literally saved lives. And that's very true. That is what these things are doing. That's why we need to change science. It's not about our careers, although a lot of what I say is about why it's good for our careers. It's about having that real world, genuine impact. Preprints are also shaping policy. This is really interesting because before the pandemic, this did not happen. However, since the pandemic, it now does. So you can go through policy documents and you will see preprints referenced in those. So these are getting back to the being real, solid bits of science. They are shaping policy. They also received an incredible amount of attention during the pandemic. This has tailed off a little bit. But what you're seeing here on the left are either the abstract views on top or the PDF downloads. And this is comparing the preprints for during the same period that were either COVID-19 or non-COVID. And all you're seeing here is that COVID-19 preprints had a huge amount of attention in terms of being downloaded. Now that's interesting, but it's not unexpected. What is surprising more are the graphs on the right here. So you're seeing citations in the top left, and again, not a big surprise. Science was changing a lot. Scientists were using a lot of COVID research. They'd all kind of switched their fields, so we could all do a bit of good. So COVID preprints received a lot more citations than non-COVID preprints. They also had a huge difference in social media activity. So this is tweets, because Twitter was still a thing back then. COVID preprints were being tweeted about a lot. This isn't just scientists. This is showing that journalists and the general public were using preprints. This is a really important big shift. News articles were also a big shift. So we saw a lot of COVID preprints being covered by the news, and this is something that has continued. So you will still see regular news articles that cover preprints. And we also looked at blogs, but same difference, but I don't know how interesting blogs are. Basically, what happened here is that the COVID pandemic induced a cultural shift in preprint use, who was using it and how they were being used. And I want to just do a little bit about this idea that because they're not peer-reviewed, they might be low quality. This is an argument that I quite often get into with people. It's a really hard mindset to shift, it turns out. But just because a preprint has not been peer-reviewed, it does not mean it's low quality. This is data from work I did, again, during the pandemic, but there are quite a lot of papers now doing similar things with different methods, and they find the same conclusions. So we would try to compare the preprint version with its published version, and we always use the first version of a preprint. So it was the earliest version an author uploaded. And we were wanting to know, do they change? So we counted the total number of panels and tables and found they were the same. You can see here on the right, this is just the difference between the number. This was true of COVID or non-COVID articles. When we were doing this, we also assessed the degree of change. So was that change a significant change? Was it just figures had been moved around? And for the most part, about 60% of what we looked at, there was no real change. Depending on which one we're looking at here, around sort of 10-ish% of what we looked at had figures that were just moved around and rearranged. Around 20% had significant content added, and then a small amount of that we looked at had content removed or added and removed. So the conclusion we drew from here was really about 20% of articles had a significant amount of content added. That's no comment on them being better or the preprint being unreliable. It was mostly things in response to reviewer comments. And I'm not sure that 20% is necessarily worth that 6 billion, let's just say. We also looked more in depth at the abstracts because abstracts are the one bit of an article that everyone can read. So we did 2 computational approaches, which are on the top here. Basically, they showed that COVID articles underwent more change in the words that they used compared to non-COVID articles. But again, it was quite a varied spread. That didn't really give much insight into what was changing. So we did the worst experiment I will ever do, because I will never do this again. We took about 400 pairs of articles and we manually ran through those abstracts to compare the changes. We did that twice because we did it the first time. We thought we can do this better. I think we just hated ourselves. But in doing that, we have a manual data set that is backed up with other computational evidence from other people. And basically, the abstracts show a similar picture to the full papers in that there's not a significant change. A lot of times there actually isn't a change. So 20 to 35%, so 35% of non-COVID did not change in their abstract. There's actually PLOS changed their instructions they give authors as a result of this work because they were concerned authors weren't actually updating their abstracts at all. Most abstracts we scored underwent minor strengthening or softening. This could be, this could be a single word change that has an important change. I think this is really important changes, but again, questionable as to how worthwhile they are in terms of the money and time invested. And around 15% of COVID, 5% of non-COVID underwent more major changes in the conclusion. Now, this is exactly where you would want a human doing a full in-depth peer review. But it's a very, very small number of the things we scored. I said there's a growing body of evidence. I will share these slides, but you can click on these links and go to all the evidence you want and read up on them. Basically, what the evidence is showing is that peer review improves a preprint by around 5%. So that's kind of taking into account all the kind of changes that occur. For example, if you have clinical preprints, the confidence intervals will reduce slightly when they're published. So it's an improvement, it's a good thing, but I think we really need to ask questions about whether or not the current way we communicate what peer review is appropriate, and if all that money and time is really worth 5% change. Now, coming back to preprints, there's a lot of concerns around preprinting. This is one of many graphs I could show you. I'm not going to highlight anything in particular, but there are very common concerns with preprinting. Generally, these are around sharing information before peer review, premature media coverage, which I kind of think is the same thing. And then, depending on who you ask, there's also concerns around duplicated records, things like being scooped. A lot of these are myths rather than genuine things to be concerned about. And I haven't included it, but there's some really good, more recent data which breaks these concerns down by geographical region. And it's very interesting to see how different geographies view sort of the benefits and the concerns of preprinting. So scooping, for example, is a really big concern for researchers based in China compared to researchers based in the US. Having talked about all those lack of changes, one really important thing to say is that public feedback is incredibly important to combat misinformation. I haven't included it in here, but misinformation, disinformation is not only on the rise, as I'm sure everyone knows, but trust in scientists is also decreasing. It's still very high, but You don't really want that to give you at all. Public feedback is a brilliant way of combating problems with scientific articles. This is one famous example. Again, it was during the pandemic. It's a really good example because this preprint was posted on, I think it was the Friday, I can't quite remember. And within 2 days, it had been removed again because people were using the public feedback functions. Lots and lots of comments on social media, some actual reviews happening, and a lot of comments on the preprint. Most people never comment on a preprint using the commenting feature. So if a preprint has lots of comments, that's usually a really big red flag. As humans, we love to focus on the negative. So again, any preprint that has this kind of social media attention, huge red flag, it's probably rubbish. It's a shame we don't give that kind of attention to the good stuff, but who likes to sit in the good stuff? So these are really good indicators for if you're looking at something that isn't your field, to know whether or not you can trust that bit of work. And I use this quite a lot when I'm reading preprints. And this feedback really does go beyond just social media. So this is an example of some of the more formal peer review integrations that bioRxiv in particular has. What you're seeing here are eLife reviews. This is really good because again, what we're starting to see is a layer on top of the publication, and it's including multiple different elements that help identify whether or not you can trust that bit of work. And I think this is important because in the 21st century, I think how we approach science has to quite drastically change. We've got to be very aware that it isn't just other scientists reading our work, it is policymakers, it's journalists, it's the general public. And we do need to think about how to communicate trustworthiness in our work to those groups. But also, the amount of science is impossible to keep on top of. So if it's not our direct field, we also need help in knowing whether to trust something. And this is really the beginnings of that. This is also where you can start to see the publish, review, curate system layering on top of each other. So in this situation, you've got the peer reviews. You could imagine where it's been published. That would also be included here. And that might be the curation layer. There's many ways of actually showing all that information. Now, peer reviewers often are portrayed as mean people who are gatekeeping and don't want us to share any of our work ever. But one of the really nice things is that open peer review has shown that these people can actually be quite collaborative. This is data from, I think, 2019. I might be wrong. It's quite old data now. Looking at the beginning of Review Commons. So if you're not familiar, Review Commons is a platform whereby you submit your preprint, they will do a peer review, and then that preprint peer review package can be sent to a variety of partner journals, and they will use that to decide whether to publish or not. So really, it's about speeding up and making that process more efficient. And at least early on in this, a little bit of a survey was done to see how people were finding the process. And generally, with open peer review, people find the process just nicer. Reviewers are more collegial, and the reviews are still improving the paper, but it's a nicer, more efficient process, which I think is a really nice big step forward. And this is one of those things that Publish Review Curate is moving us towards. Preprints also open up this much higher dimensional space for experimenting with what peer review is and does. This is just a preprint review features framework. You can read about this if you want to, but what we're finding is that there is this growing ecosystem. So we've got a whole bunch of preprint servers. There's a lot actually now. I think there's over 50 life science focused preprint servers. But on top of that, we're getting these preprint feedback initiatives. And there are over 35 of these now in existence as well. These range from quite minimalist, sort of free-form forms of feedback, which would be feedback on social media. There are people who will actually do peer review and just do it on Blue Sky. I wish they would put that somewhere more robust, but still, it is a peer review. But they can also range right up to things like actual journal peer reviews. So eLife's the biggest example here, but Review Commons are quite journal-like. And then in the middle, there's the middle bit. So these are really a bit more flexible. So Pre-review are a great service for community-focused reviewing. These are actually in this space, they're doing the best in terms of equity around peer review. Prelights is not really peer review, it's more of a highlighting service, news and views type thing. Amazing for early career researchers if you want to get into scientific writing. But they do also highlight and do a little bit of a review on the preprints. Rapid reviews is great because it's bringing a lot of students into peer review. And so you can see how this experimenting is not just experimenting what peer review is, how it works, but also who is involved. And it's making it a lot more open and accessible. And then on top of this, we have a growing body of linking and discovering tools. So EuropeMC is the big one for discovering all these things in one place. But there's also metadata behind the scenes stuff that is generally less interesting, but incredibly important. That goes on behind closed doors. So I've also kind of talked about how changing all this allows us to recognize preprint review as an actual activity. And this is just one example of how this might work with Review Commons. I've already said this is just a visual version. This activity of reviewing preprints is growing. This started a lot later, so it started really only in about 2017. So it is very much in its infancy still, but it grows year on year. The drop off here, again, this is quite old data because it's February 2023, but that drop off is back to it's normal. This is also not all the preprint reviews that are existing, but it is a growing activity. It's also becoming more formally recognized. So if you're in France, there are 18 doctoral schools that will accept preprints recommended by PCI, and thus they accept them as the same they would if there was a journal article. EMBO fellowships accept peer-reviewed preprints for their fellowship applications. And Plan S also have this statement that basically preprints that are peer-reviewed should be held in an equivalent status as journal articles are. So I just want to talk a little bit about preprints and open science. I've talked about the cost of publisher co-opted open access. This is not a sustainable situation. It's getting worse because this business model is great for the shareholders. It gets them a lot more money. And it's terrible for science and scientists. It's forcing us to publish more, publish less quality stuff, not be as rigorous with things like peer review or the quality of what's coming out. We need to move a system that is not dominated by the traditional publishing industry. And these APC costs are increasing every year. I kind of already said that, but this is a little bit more data to show it. They're even higher now. And this problem exists because traditional publishers don't just dominate publishing. The companies that own the publishers actually own the entire life cycle of research. Everything from how we find research articles to how we analyze our data, how we write our papers, how we publish, the outreach activities we do, and how we as scientists and academics are assessed. As long as publishers dominate that system, we're kind of stuck. It's going to continue to be bad and get worse. So we need to break out of this. Preprints represent, in my opinion, the best way to break out of this system because they remove publisher names, they remove all the proxies that we usually rely on, and they allow a lot more experimentation with what new things might exist. Forces us to focus on the science and the content of an article and a person's career, rather than where someone has published and how many Nature papers they have. In terms of recognition, this is also growing at the more sort of government policy level side of things. So this is a EU statement that was released in 2023, basically saying that we should be moving towards a scholarly publishing model that is not for profit, open access, multi-format, with no costs for authors or readers. A PRC system that is supported by institutions and funders achieves this. Around the same time, we also had the US issue of similar statement. This is kind of the Nelson memo. And this now is going ahead, I think, in the next 6 months. Basically, all federally funded research should be freely available. Same kind of statement. The EU go a little bit further than the US does. But again, a PRC system achieves this aim. So there is a very top level desire and movement towards this kind of of system. Just to bring it back to preprints, I said this is about change. And one of the things with the publish review create model is that I'm not entirely sure it achieves this real change. But with preprinting, we have this potential for a real meaningful change towards a community first system. So this is really about tipping the scales away from it being about money and profit and it being about good quality science. And what we need is a system where it's the academic community who set the rules, not the publishers. So we should be saying, well, actually, this is what counts for hiring people we're going to work with. We don't want to work with someone who's uber competitive and publishes rubbish just because they publish in high impact journals. We want to work with someone who's going to sit on the committees and do all the horrible stuff we don't want to do, so they'll share the workload. This is really important from a diversity and equity standpoint as well. There was I don't know if you all saw it, brilliant study, I think last year, maybe the year before, where there were actual comments from a lot of male respondents saying, I don't do these activities because they don't benefit my career. And this means that a lot of these service activities, peer review, it generally falls to women to do those roles, and that holds back research careers because men actively avoid them because it doesn't help their research career move forward. And I don't think that's the colleagues we should be wanting to work with, personally. So, I said it was going to be a little bit controversial. I've kind of tried to sell publish review curate there, but now I want to step back and just take a more objective look at the system to see if this is something we should move forward with. I would argue we're actually achieving publish review curate right now without using those words. Because if we have, for example, I post a preprint and then I submit that preprint to Nature, I've done publish review create. I posted my preprint and then Nature are doing the review creation step. This is also why I say we need to separate these two steps out more. So we are kind of achieving this system. The review part is growing. It's questionable if it's being significantly improved. It's being made more efficient, but remember, a lot of people do see peer review as this stamp of validation and approval of a bit of work, and that is not being changed with publish review curate. It's still that validation that this work is trustworthy just because two people have looked at it. I think what would be great is if we saw more review experiments, like real experiments in how we do it. Arcadia Science in the US are an example of a company doing this, but there's so much more we could do. Curation is a big missing piece. I've seen a lot of discussions around PRC. Nobody has an answer for curation yet. Nobody really knows what it means, and there's an argument as to how to define curation. Nobody knows when it occurs. Does it occur before you do the review? Does it occur after you do the review? Nobody knows who does it, how it might look. I don't think you can move forward with PRC until this curation step is at least people start to experiment with it. And it's not currently happening. But I also think there's some other things going on that people aren't talking about for whatever reason. So one of the most important things is this model does not move us away from the curation proxies that we currently use. This is just a reordering and in a more efficient system. But those proxies that are damaging our careers and doing bad things for science, they still exist in this system. It's also very, very open for hijacking by publishers. And I will say, there's already been an article either this year or the very end of last year, where a publisher suggested what they could do is charge for the peer review part and also the publishing part. And I can guarantee that won't be a joint charge that's currently equal to APCs. It'll be two really big charges that are more than the APC we currently pay. This is what went wrong with open access. Open access has ultimately resulted in the system we have, which is way less equitable because the publishers were allowed to take it over. It's happening now with PRC. Nobody listens to me, so I argue against this a lot, but I think we need to be really careful in not letting that happen. It also moves us away from the full potential of preprinting and towards, like I said, this sort of minimally improved version of what we already have. There's positives and negatives to doing that, but I think we need to have that discussion, and it's not a discussion that is currently happening. What I think would be nice to see is this kind of system suggested by Richard Sever a couple of years ago. So we have this publishing step, which is posting preprints. Oh, this is my version. I must have skipped a slide. So this is basically this image here is Richard Sever's version. So you would publish your preprint and then you'd have this sort of badging system on top of it. It could be review services, comments, journals could be part of it. There's multiple ways of doing this. What I think instead of publish, review, curate, what we should be doing is doing this publish integrity trust thing instead. So you publish as a preprint, and then the next step is not about review or curation. It's about making sure that preprint, that published article, is full of integrity and it can be trusted. So this is adding in trust signals like peer review is a trust signal, but also context-dependent citations, how are people using it? If replication is relevant, then can we reproduce someone's code, for example? That's a sign of trust. And also the integrity side of that is have the authors been operating with integrity? So when they publish their work, have they shared the data and the code? Have they used good methods that are reproducible? Have they been hyperbolic or not? There's a lot of different signals, and I think that, in my opinion, is a better way forward than publish, review, curate, but it's one of many routes forward. Importantly, this should all be community-led. We should be in charge of doing all of this. And as part of that, it really should be about community ownership as well. So community-owned preprint servers, community-owned integrity systems, potentially community-owned overlay journals, community-run lists. You can see how this can kind of build up, but it should be, again, tipping those scales. We need to be in charge of this system, not stakeholders and profit. The future isn't set yet. We haven't gone down too far down any of the potential paths we could go down. So this we really do need to avoid this publisher silo with preprinting, and this is where I think PRC is being dragged at the moment. I would like to see this big open ecosystem much more. But there's a lot of questions we need to ask around that. And these are things some people are asking. I'm not sure enough people are asking them. Otherwise, I'll end it there for questions. If you have, well, there's about 4 hours worth of videos there, but if you have a spare half hour, there's some really useful, I think, I made them, I'm biased, some good YouTube videos around the history of preprinting, history of peer review. You probably will be familiar with Robert Maxwell, but I spend half an hour talking about that man. And the podcast is linked there as well if you want that. If you do have any questions, the thing in the chat is the address to email. Otherwise, happy for any questions.
Thank you very much, Jonny, for your very inspiring presentation. Are there any questions from the audience? Let's start our Q&A session. So you can either decide to speak or you can also write it down into the chat. Okay, so. Okay, I just have a question out of curiosity about, about citation of preprint. Well, you say that obviously a preprint are attached with DOIs, so they can be citable in a way. But then if you publish your article that was already preprint, it means that another DOI will be applied to that publication. So is there a system that can link publication? Otherwise, this could create redundancies in our knowledge. And I know that it is possible to versioning your print, so you can update obviously your documents, but people might not be aware of that. So how would you say about this?
Yeah, I'm in way too many meetings about this. There is a system in place to try and match a preprint to the published version. Doesn't work very well. It turns out it's a really hard thing to do. So that the way that most of these systems work is they try to match the title and author list between the preprint and published version. The title often changes, so it's usually fuzzy matching, which kind of works, kind of doesn't. The author list also actually changes surprisingly more than you would think. Some systems use the first author. I don't recommend that because obviously the first author actually changes more. Some systems use the corresponding author. That's a little bit more reliable, but not always. Again, kind of surprising how often that changes between the two. With versions, it depends on the preprint server. Some keep the same DOI, some have a new one for each version. Whenever you're citing them, it's just really important to make sure you cite the right version. Most citation software will do that for you. But if you were doing it manually, for some bizarre reason, make sure you put down which version it is. I mean, you include a URL that will link to the exact version. When you're citing more generally, you cite the most recent thing you have access to. So I give this kind of talk a lot across Africa, and across Africa they have very, very big problems accessing literature. And this question comes up a lot. So what I tell them is, you cannot cite something you haven't read. Now we all do this. I'm convinced we all do this. We all sometimes read an abstract and say, "I'll read this later," and then we just cite it anyway. But the preprint is a full version you can cite. So if the choice is a preprint I can read or an abstract for a paper I can't read, I will cite the preprint. If I can read the paper version, I will cite the paper version because that's the more recent version. So it's just the most recent version unless you can't access it.
Thank you. We have a message in the chat by Federica. Federica, do you want to speak or just I can read it out? Okay, so the message is, thank you for this presentation, Jonny. I changed my mind some perceived weaknesses of preprints, and I think this kind of meta-science research can do a lot to help bring the change. In your experience, is this the case, or are there any kinds of action that can nudge the scientific community in this direction? Publisher aside, I'm thinking about resistance or hesitation from authors.
Yeah, this was basically my job. So the meta science really, really helps because it's really important to have data. I think as scientists, we often think that we will follow the data more than we do. When you're trying to change people's minds, data actually is irrelevant. It really doesn't matter. It's about emotions and experience. So when you're trying to change someone's mind, the best thing you can do is show them how preprinting has been beneficial, or get them to do it and experience some benefits from doing it. So at the moment, for example, if you post a preprint, generally, you will get more citations than if you don't post a preprint. More people will read it, that kind of stuff. You can get job offers because you've posted preprints that you wouldn't have otherwise got because you've got no evidence that you've done any work. I know someone recently he started his own lab up, very new PI. His colleagues told him his paper wasn't good enough for the journal he really wanted to get it into. So he didn't submit there, posted it as a preprint, and the editor got in touch to say, "I really like this work," and he got into the journal he wanted to get into. Otherwise, he would have gone into a lower tier journal. So there are a lot of benefits to doing it. The caveat to that is obviously your work has to be interesting to lots of people. Another thing I think we all seem to think is that our work is the best thing ever. Most scientific articles are never read. If you get, I think it's 10 citations on a paper, you're doing amazingly well. So you're not guaranteed these benefits, but if you post preprints and your work is interesting to people, you will get those kind of things. Nudge efforts are a really good way of combining all those things. So I used to, when I was a postdoc, I used to sit in the lab and I would just talk about preprints a bit too much. I mean, it was kind of, I was doing this on the side as well, so I had a reason to talk about it. But just because I was talking about it a lot, people overheard that, and that got a few labs to preprint for the first time because there was this weird person who wouldn't shut up about it. You can do things like whenever I post a preprint, I celebrate that as if I've done the final step and it's all finished. Like you would celebrate a paper being published. Because when you post a preprint, this is what physicists do. In physics, the publishing step is nothing more than a formality. So they celebrate posting a preprint and getting the work out there. So things like that are really good. You can do cake parties for preprints. I've seen people doing. You can also do things like cite preprints. When you're doing a journal club, instead of doing a journal club where you talk about a paper that's already been published and peer reviewed and you don't share that with anyone, instead talk about a preprint. Find a new preprint that's been posted within about a month, talk about it, send that to the authors. You've helped the authors. You've done a good thing for science if you publish that comment or as an actual review. And we do this with ASAPBio. Quite often the authors will respond to you very positively. And if you're doing a journal club with students, great training experience for them. Slightly bigger nudge effort would be actually integrating preprints as part of courses that you teach. There's a really good example of a person in Latin America who teaches about how publishing works, and he uses preprints to teach that as a US lab who did the same thing. If you have graduation requirements to publish X number of papers, change it to posting preprints instead. It's better for the students because there's less pressure to get that done, and the work's out there. It speeds things up. It's better for everyone. But yeah, there's loads you can do.
Thank you for answering. Is there any other question for Jonny?
Well, maybe Michaela, if I may, I've got a question. Probably
yes,
Jonny.
of course.
I'm not sure. Sorry if it was already mentioned during the talk, but I was wondering, just asking about your experience. I'm curious, do you know, I mean, according to your experience, have you seen any changes in how funding bodies are treating preprints? In other words, do you think that sometimes preprints may be a valid part of research evaluation in grants?
Yeah, they are. Europe kind of leading the way now, although it's a little bit different with US being philanthropy funded. So a lot of funders now accept preprints as evidence of productivity for grants and fellowships. I know quite a few people who've had European-based fellowships because they posted preprints. They really wouldn't have got it otherwise. There's also an increasing shift, the other end of that, to assessing the outcomes of grants and in hiring practices at universities and research institutions where preprints account for the same way a publication would. Like I said, sometimes it has to be a peer-reviewed preprint. I don't really like that, but at least it's a step towards that. So you have to check the individual funder, but most funders are now quite positive. Most bioscience funders are quite positive towards preprints. And there is, as I said, that especially in Europe, there is that top-down pressure now starting to happen, which I think is going to create much bigger, more rapid change.
Okay, we have another message in the chat. First of all, by Gabriele. So first of all, thank you for your talk. If not substantial changes are done in the manuscript from preprint to publication version, can the journal require to remove the preprint from the online platform if authors do not choose open access due to some imposed embargo, for example?
No, I think is the answer. So the thing we're seeing with some journals is they're now also an extra thing they're charging for is they're charging for no embargo or open access. So the article development charge from the American Chemical Society is a really good example of that. They now charge you extra money if you want your work to be open and not embargoed. If you post a preprint, it's kind of too late. It's out there. You can't really take it back. The platforms won't just remove them for no good reason. I would also say most journals, like 99% of journals now accept preprints. Most of the big publishers also own their own preprint server. So Research Square is owned by Springer Nature, for example. SSRN is owned by Elsevier. The Gates Foundation, as a publisher, have their own preprint server. So that landscape's also changing a little bit. But generally, no, I wouldn't say they could ask for it to be removed. What they do generally say is that they don't allow you to update your preprint with the peer review comments if they're going to publish your work. I have no idea how they actually enforce that because they can't. But that's one of the things they'll say. But I don't think they can enforce it.
Okay, thanks. Okay, time to say some closing word if there are not other questions from the audience. Okay. So thank you again, Jonny, for this today's talk about preprints. I think it was very really inspiring and informative about preprints. So we have learned very good stuff. Okay. Remember the audience, next online seminar on open science, which will close this year cycle of seminar, will be held by Dr. Friederike Kors on 11 June at 3 p.m. So put it into your calendar, and yes, and also keep us follow on our social. Okay, thank you very much for today, and have a good evening.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.